my channel. I'm Jess Cannell, and in the last few months we have been going through all things Kennedy. And the primary book that we started with was Maureen Callahan's book, Ask Not: The Kennedys and the Women They Destroyed. And we have walked through this book. We are nearly to the end of it. But one of the things that Maureen Callahan raises as sort of an issue is in the second chapter that we get on Jackie, which is her post-assassination, immediate planning of the funeral for JFK, and then her plans. She makes the comment multiple times that Jackie knew her first and most important job was to do a faithful job raising the children. And my guess would be she thought that that would be sufficient to let us all know, like, that was her priority. But I was disappointed because in the third, we get 4 chapters on Jackie. In the third one, which is all about her years of marriage to Aristotle Onassis, there's not a sentence about where the children are, what they're doing, nothing. It does actually say that Jackie went back and forth between New York. And readers who knew that the children were in New York were able to help me know they were in a school there and she was traveling back and forth often. But the book does not say that. And so for me, I was coming in, I know quite a bit about certain aspects of Kennedy things, but I didn't know about Jackie and her post-assassination life. And so I had no clue as I was reading where the children were, what was happening, what's going on with these most important children with her most important job. And the question was left unanswered. So I've told you guys before, I have some really amazing antique shops down in the square near our house. And I went to a little antique store a couple of days ago, maybe 3 days ago now, and was just flipping through a little basket that had some magazines in it. And I found 2, but this is the one we're gonna look at today. This one is the Ladies' Home Journal from November of 1973. It is a 10 years after the assassination look at Caroline Kennedy. I haven't opened this one. This article is looking at famous Americans and their reaction the day that JFK was shot. So we're going to look at both of these articles. I want the update on Caroline and how she was parented. This is actually written by her former nanny, Maud Shaw. So it's a first-hand account. So I'm excited about that one. And this one is going to be interesting just in relation because this was November 1973. So let's go ahead and open it together. It says, Ladies' Home Journal, the magazine women believe in. November 1973, it was 60 cents. The article is titled, Caroline Kennedy Turns 16 by her former nanny, Maud Shaw. Okay, y'all know I'm gonna try not to do this all the time, but some of these advertisements are just too good. This one is, it actually looks a lot like 80s coloring to me for it being in the 70s. Her hair is obviously 70s, but the blues and pinks. Oh man, there were carpet ads for this 70s carpet. How fun is that? Would anyone put orange and yellow carpets in their house now? Ah, I'm pulling right off I'm serious, I don't normally share this many advertisements, but that is funny, isn't it? The flooring. Well, the sunny floor that shines without waxing. Okay, so we're gonna go in and we're gonna look at, oh gosh, y'all. So this magazine right here, I'm gonna have to do other episodes on this because there is an article of Princess Anne sneak preview of a royal wedding. Unless that's just a 1-page quick peek, we're gonna need to make that a totally separate video. And then there is a whole episode called I Was There the Night Marilyn Monroe Died. So I plan to do a totally separate episode focused on that. But I'm gonna go to the article about Caroline because that is the one that hopefully will answer some, give us a little peek of what was happening 10 years post-assassination. I was expecting the more ladies magazine style that we had in the 80s, 90s, and aughts, where there'd be some kind of splashy headline, major photo, but this is like in line. It's way more newspaper style, where there are advertisements and the articles are written all around it. So I don't know, just the layout is kind of interesting and different than I was expecting. Okay. So there's an article about bringing children up. So this kind of gives an idea of like, and then there's one about spending money. So this really was a magazine that was a little bit different than like 8 ways to keep your man, but instead more like, hey, for various aspects of your life, and here's the working woman, an article about that. So, oh, there's the Marilyn Monroe article. I'm just gonna keep going, gotta get to the one we're wanting to get to. All right, first look at the top. Now, this is interesting. Okay, the front photo made me wonder, are we getting a very like idealized little girl picture of Caroline? Because this to me looks way too young. So it is possible that this photo was her, but at say age 10 or 12. To me, this does not look like a 16-year-old. You guys let me know what you think. But when I turn in here, now we get to a Caroline that looks way more like a 16-year-old of the 1970s. Let's see if I can get a better photo. That one's better. So here's Caroline, and this is Maud Shaw. Maud Shaw is the one writing this article. And I'm just gonna read through it, and we're gonna enjoy. The subheading says, on November 27th, Caroline celebrates an important birthday. Who better to tell us what she is like as a young woman than Miss Shaw, the nanny to whom her upbringing was entrusted for more than 7.5 years. Then we get this picture that reminds us all of Caroline as a young child. There she is with her father, mother. Jackie looks beautiful. Jack is playful, and there's Caroline with her family. Maud Shaw. From the very start, I was impressed by the Kennedys' determination to raise their daughter in as near a normal manner as possible. Caroline could have been a brat like some of her cousins, but she was not. Okay, there is some shade being thrown down. This is pretty open. This would have been 5 years after, so this is 10 years after JFK's assassination, but this is 5 years after RFK's assassination. This is a full 4 years after Chappaquiddick, which is another book that we're reading right now. So, but RFK, whose children were known as hellions, this seems to be a pretty obvious dig at them. One day last summer, a small packet flipped through the letterbox on the door of my home in Portsmouth, England. My eye caught sight of the postmark, Hyannisport, Massachusetts. It brought back a flood of memories of 7.5 years of my life. Wonderful years during which I was happy and proud to give my love and devotion to the 2 children of President John F. Kennedy and his wife, Jacqueline. And if I remember Caroline Kennedy more than her brother, John Jr., it's because I first held her in my arms when she was 14 days old and cared for her for the next 90 months. That Hyannisport letter was from a friend, a children's nurse who sees Caroline when the Kennedy clan gathers for the summer. My friend had enclosed a selection of recent newspaper and magazine photographs of Caroline, together with a letter that said Caroline has grown into a tall, very attractive young lady with lovely blue eyes. She has a finishing school's polished poise, but it hasn't dulled her natural courtesy and friendliness. She greets old acquaintances as such, and though she lives in the atmosphere of wealth and glamour among the, quote, beautiful people, I don't think much of it has rubbed off on her. Caroline has a quiet charm. One is aware of an inner serenity, though she pursues the usual activities and excitements of her age, although she gives promise of a delightful maturity. When I read that, my eyes became misty. Those words were written about a girl whose upbringing had been entrusted to me. I was closer to her than any woman, except her own mother. One of my dearest possessions is the scrapbook given to me by Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy when I left the family's employ. The inscription reads, "You brought such happiness to our lives, and especially to President Kennedy, because you made his children what? You made our children what they are," end quote. If I helped make Caroline Kennedy what she is now at the age of 16, then I am indeed proud, for I believe she has turned out to be exactly the girl I always wanted her to be. The first 7.5 years of a child's life are long enough for someone close to her to know and understand the characteristics she will carry into later life. Thus, it comes as no surprise to learn that the sweet character Caroline always exhibited in childhood is still part of her today. So this is interesting, and it does bring up something that I've observed with our children, which is now, if you don't know, I have children at a wide range. My oldest is 22, my youngest is 6.5. And I do see the ways that, for example, my son, who is 22, will say things that harken back to memories that I have with him at 5, 6, 7 years old. And it's interesting to observe. It's not that he's the same in every way, but there are the tendrils of who the adult person will be in those early years. So that's fascinating. She spent time from when she was 14 days old, it says. Ever since I parted from her, I have followed her life in newspapers and from letters sent to me by my friends in that circle we call the, quote, nursery mafia, end quote. The portrait of Caroline that emerges is so close to what I would have imagined that I feel I still know her as intuitively as I once did. I last saw Caroline in May 1965 when Mrs. Kennedy and the children came to England to be present at Runnymede near Windsor, where a monument was dedicated to the memory of the late President Kennedy. By 1965, Caroline had lived through more than most girls experience in their whole lives, a life of luxury, adulation, and cruel tragedy. But she had adjusted to it all. From the very first, I had been impressed by Mrs. Kennedy's determination to raise her daughter in as near normal a manner as possible, and to shield her from the publicity that could easily have spoiled her. As a result, Caroline, who could have been a brat, was not. I think I became aware of how unspoiled and considerate Caroline was when I took her to stay with me at my own home, at the time in Sheerness, Kent, while Mrs. Kennedy made a series of official visits in England prior to the Runnymede ceremony. My home was a long way from the standards of the White House or any other Kennedy home. Mine was a simple, terraced home with a front door opening directly onto the sidewalk. It had 3 rooms downstairs and 4 small bedrooms above. "I'm afraid your room is a bit tiny, Caroline," I said as I tucked her in that first night. "I hope you'll feel at home in my house." "Oh, Miss Shaw," she replied, "your house is lovely and I like my little room. And you're here, aren't you?" That's sweet. It's fun the way that we do have a special connection with people who we spent time with as children. And you can see why this would have been like a beloved grandmother to her almost, or a sweet aunt. It would have had that feel of someone so familiar, so heartwarming, and so Caroline wouldn't have cared what her house looked like. She just was glad to be with Maud Shaw. There was never any petulance or arrogance in Caroline. She has a gift for gentleness and consideration for other people. When Caroline was about 7, we were living in the Kennedy apartment on 5th Avenue in New York City. It was a very large place, and both Caroline and John had lovely rooms near my own comfortable sitting room. So she lived with Jackie. She moved with Jackie after the assassination, lived in that apartment that we've heard about on 5th Avenue with Jackie. One day, Caroline came in to see me and stood with her hands on her hips looking around. "Your room is very small, Miss Shaw," she said suddenly. "It's much smaller than mine, and you're much bigger than I am." "But I'm very happy here, Caroline. It's nice and cozy. I like it." "But it's smaller than mine," she persisted. "Well, I haven't as many toys as you, but I do like it in here. Really, I do." "That's all right then," she said, nodded, and trotted out. A little while later, we were reading our books together at bedtime, as was our regular routine, when she suddenly put her book down. "Are you rich, Miss Shaw?" For a moment, I couldn't think how to answer. Then I said, "No, I'm not rich, but I have enough, thank you." "Where do you get your money from?" I realized what was on her mind. It was connected to her father's death. She couldn't understand who was paying me to look after her, now that he wasn't there. You see, many times when the president said goodbye to Caroline, he would tell her that he was off to earn some money for her mummy, to buy toys and to pay me. I had to explain then that her daddy had seen to it that there was enough money for her and John and their mummy, and to pay me. She was an endearing child, and it is hard to find a person who does not like her. I loved her more than any of the 50-odd children I have helped raise, not because of who Caroline was, but because of what she was. Caroline had so much to give. I envy anyone who can count her as their friend. She used to put it, I was her bestest friend in the whole world. I was also her blood sister. Once, when I had to explain to her that I wasn't really part of her family, she insisted that we go through the ritual of pricking our fingers and mingling our blood. I don't think Caroline will ever be short of true friends because she has the knack of remembering little things that please others. Sometime after our discussion about my little room, Caroline went on a trip with her mother and mailed me a postcard of a Van Gogh painting. It was of a little room. Caroline had chosen the card and sent it with the message, "A little room like yours." Then, after I had left the Kennedy employ, Caroline sent me a gift that demonstrated her thoughtfulness. Once, somebody had given her a pair of toy mice. I admired them greatly and told Caroline so. Sure enough, some 18 months later in 1967, she got an identical pair and sent them to me at Christmas. I treasure them dearly. As a youngster, Caroline was able to show fondness. One of my dearest memories of her, oh, this is interesting, you guys. This has to deal with Joe Kennedy. It says, "A comfort to grandfather." As a youngster, Caroline was able to show fondness. One of my dearest memories of her stems from a visit we made to Palm Beach in early 1962, after the president's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, had suffered a severe stroke. I felt very sorry for Ambassador Kennedy. Yeah, it's sad to have a stroke, but this man was awful. He had always been good to me and made me feel welcome in his home whenever we were there. So she has goodwill toward him. It was heartbreaking to see him there in a chair, barely able to move or speak. But it didn't seem to bother Caroline a bit. She loved her grandfather. And for hours on end, she would sit by his chair with her arm round his shoulder, chatting away to him. It struck me as very touching that so small a child, she was only 4, should take such an interest in comforting her grandfather. Ambassador Kennedy was immensely proud of Caroline, and I always suspected that she was his favorite grandchild. He used to say that she was born a little lady and that was what she was going to be. I think he was right. So one thing that's interesting to me in this is that Caroline, I don't know about the employ of all of the Kennedy grandchildren and that kind of thing, but Caroline is an ambassador right now. She's one of the few that I know about. I mean, we know about RFK Jr. He obviously has stepped into politics, but most of the Kennedy clan has receded into relative privacy. They might do charitable events or that kind of thing, but a lot of them keep out of the limelight. But she is an ambassador, I believe, to Australia still currently. And so it's interesting that she was spending time with her ambassador grandfather at age 4, and that she has actually taken that same position in the world. Just kind of fascinating. If I have one fear about Caroline as she reaches womanhood, it's that she is vulnerable to hurt. When she was small, Caroline was capable of holding her feelings tight inside her, and it took careful coaxing to find out what was wrong. John wasn't like that. He'd come bursting in and tell you exactly what he felt. With Caroline, you had to wait until she was prepared to tell you, and she usually didn't unburden herself until bedtime. That's quite mature for a young child. She must have learned that kind of emotional withholding from her parents. Bedtime was Caroline's unwinding hour. We would sit and talk, and gradually her little troubles would come out. You would have to know Caroline well before she would ever tell you her innermost feelings. That's like Jackie. Jackie was described that way. Very often, when I've looked at my scrapbook full of pictures of her smiling and bouncing about, I've wondered how much of her real self she is hiding. That's sad. I hope she is always happy, but I don't think it's easy to tell if she is from her demeanor. In no way do I suggest that Caroline was a mournful child. Far from it. She had inherited her father's sense of fun and was constantly teasing and laughing at her own little jokes. She'd hide my shoes or jump out from behind a door and tell me some riddle and burst into peals of laughter when I couldn't guess the answer. But the thoughtful, sensitive side of her was never far below the surface. If she teased too much or did something inconsiderate, as any child can do, you only had to tell her, and she was immediately contrite. I don't think Caroline has it in her to hurt anyone intentionally, and it's probably because she is so sensitive herself. Like all sensitive people, Caroline had a slight lack of confidence in herself. This is another area where she was different from her brother John. He'd jump into any situation and take the consequences with either a laugh or a roar of protest. But not Caroline. She's marvelous fun and shows all the hallmarks of leadership. But she is not, I think, the sort of girl who could burst into a room full of people and take over. In a child, she was always shy when meeting people her own age. When she first attended the little school set up in the solarium on the White House roof, I could tell she was worried. As usual, I found out why at bedtime. Caroline thought that one of the other girls in class was better than she was at everything. It took weeks before Caroline really began to feel on par with the other little girl. And during that time, I encouraged Caroline to realize that she was as good as her classmate. We worked on the things that Caroline felt she was behind on and generally stoked up her confidence until at last she grew out of her little phobia. When all the other Kennedy children were being taught to swim, Caroline resolutely refused to make progress. It wasn't until the instructor confessed he could do nothing with her that I took her down to the pool by herself and worked on her confidence. After that, she swam like a fish. When she felt at home, her shyness disappeared. At the White House, for instance, Caroline was always encouraged to meet the important visitors. And there she was, perfectly at ease. Both the President and Mrs. Kennedy thought this was good for Caroline, and it was. And Caroline certainly loved these grand occasions. She would walk in absolutely self-possessed and curtsy like a perfect lady. I think the only time she was put out was when she met the King of Saudi Arabia, who kissed her again and again, to the delight of everyone except Caroline, who was having trouble with the king's whiskers. Her report, "He's nice, but he kept on kissing me." Okay, I don't love that. I actually have experienced something like this where someone who did not know my child well, not a relative, just a random person that we met, was far too affectionate with one of my children on a meeting them. It wasn't anything highly inappropriate, but it was like this, too familiar for a stranger. And the child hated it, I hated it, and I moved into action, and it still wasn't enough to disquiet my feelings. I felt very angry afterward and needed to talk it through. I think the person had their reasons. I don't know King of Saudi Arabia's reasons. The person that did it to me, they had lost a child like a year before, and they were a small child, and I think this person was enamored with the sweetness of that toddler butter skin that I that's what I call it. It's just like butter skin. It's like so soft, so sweet. And I think they were just kind of not thinking. But I don't like this. I don't like when people are aggressively affectionate with a child that's not their own. Frankly, no one should be aggressively affectionate, but a parent can read and understand the affection level that's normal and familiar between them and their child. But a stranger shouldn't have this level of like kept on kissing her, kissed her again and again. And I don't love that everyone else was delighted. I feel like in that moment, that's leaves her unprotected. They didn't ask me. During the days at the White House, Caroline began to realize how important her father was. Her favorite description of him was, "My daddy is the boss of the whole world." That's such a child's way of viewing it. And the president, even still we say like they're the leader of the free world, or they're certainly one of the most famous people in the entire world immediately. When she really wanted to make a point, she'd say, "My daddy is the boss over everyone, Miss Shaw, even you." On one occasion, however, her confidence took a slight knock. It was early 1963, that's the year of the assassination, on the day when the family was leaving the White House to go to Camp David, about 20 minutes away by helicopter. The president, always conscious by the cost of these trips, insisted that the moment we landed at Camp David, we had to scoot out of the helicopter so that it could go back to its base. It was my habit to bundle the children in and out as fast as possible, and since it was a cold day, I kept their ski suits firmly zipped up while we flew. Caroline began to complain of being too hot and wanted to take off her suit. "No, Caroline, you can't do that," I explained. "Otherwise, John will want his off too, and it will take ages to zip you all up again when we land. And you know your daddy doesn't like wasting time." Caroline stumped off to where her father was sitting and took the matter up with him. I couldn't hear anything inside the helicopter, of course, but I saw them talking, and then the president turned to me with a helpless expression of his face. Knowing what it was about, I shook my head. The president whispered something in Caroline's ear, and then she looked up at him, wide-eyed. She came back to her seat with a puzzlement on her face. "Daddy says you're the boss, Miss Shaw." I was dying to laugh, but I just couldn't let her illusions get shattered like that. "Well, Daddy's the boss, really," I confided. "It's just that he knows I'm right about not taking your suit off." She was happy to leave it at that. That's really sweet. That's a good story. JFK's sense of humor. There is a lot of her father in Caroline. She has his sense of humor and his readiness to diffuse an awkward situation with a smile or quip. It was one of the things I admired about the president. There must have been many times when he was worried about affairs of state, yet I never saw him snap at the children. He could be firm, but I can't remember a time when he carried his worries into the nursery. Well, that's interesting. It's possible that she's doing a bit of, post-death glorification, which does happen, especially at this time and especially with this man. But, that if she's a truthful person, which we have no reason to believe she's not, then she says she never saw him snap at the children. And even though he was worried, she doesn't remember him bringing his worries into the nursery, that instead when he came in there, he was spending time with the children. As a result, I don't think Caroline will ever be one to throw her weight about, despite the power and authority her name has bestowed on her. By the time she was 7, she had already adopted a very sensible view of herself. Caroline had started to attend full-time convent school. I didn't realize they sent her to Catholic school. And one day she came home disgruntled. As always, I waited for her to unburden herself. "It's the other girls at school," she said at last. "They keep on telling me how lucky I am to be Caroline Kennedy, and they keep staring at me. Isn't that silly, Miss Shaw? I'm just the same as anyone else, aren't I?" Well, she's not just the same as anyone else. She is Caroline Kennedy. I always used to urge Caroline and John to tidy up their rooms. There were maids to do it for them, of course, but I felt that they should do things like that for themselves. Quite right. I agree with Maud Shaw. One time I had to keep after Caroline to straighten things out, but she replied, "I haven't time, Miss Shaw. Can't you see I'm very busy?" "Very well, Caroline," I retorted. "But don't be surprised if I'm too busy the next time you ask me to do something for you." With that, I withdrew. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, she came into my room, smiling sheepishly. "I've done my room, Miss Shaw. I wasn't too busy after all." That's so good. It's so good that these children who, my daddy's the boss of the whole world, but they're not only in political power, but they also have wealth and comfort and ease as just like normal staples in their everyday life. And so to have a nanny that lovingly holds the line and that does things like teaching them what's proper and making them clean up after themselves is very, very good. It was about that time that I had a small run-in with her, Ever since she had been old enough to begin to fend for herself, I had always dressed in Caroline's room. It was a way of teaching her how to put on clothes. If I dressed at the same time, it also meant I was occupied and therefore able to resist the temptation to help her. I've always thought it better to let children get on with something like that, even if they make a bit of a mess of it. It's all part of encouraging their self-confidence. Yeah, this is like the principle. I mean, it's on the flip side too. It's like with children, and then also with like people with Alzheimer's, or people who are losing their physical capacities in old age. Either way, you let them do as much as they can do. So whether we're talking about a 1.5-year-old that's struggling to like put a bead on a string, you just let them struggle, or an older person who is struggling, it's like as much as they can do, that's what they ought to do, and then step in if they really can't do it. But that's good. Anyway, I had grown very used to simply walking in Caroline's room at any time. But one afternoon when I did so, she suddenly said, "Oh, Miss Shaw, can't I have any privacy around here?" That sounds like an adult. It sounds like something she's imitating. I was so surprised, I just stood there for a second or two. "I'm sorry, Caroline," I said, and I quickly went out. I pondered the incident for a while and then went back to her room. This time I knocked on the door and waited. "Come in," I heard her say. I opened the door. "May I come in, Caroline?" She was standing there with an embarrassed look on her face. "Of course you can," she said. "I don't really mind when you come in." I changed the subject quickly, but after that I was more careful about barging into her room. So Maud Shaw seems like a very attentive, thoughtful person who interacted with the children in ways that would make them wise, would make them careful, but also was respectful of them as individuals. That's really good. Becoming an individual. It was the first time that I realized Caroline was becoming conscious of herself as an individual. She was quite right, of course, to feel that she was entitled to have her own room to herself. She was essentially a modest girl. I remember both Mrs. Kennedy and I being amused at this trait. Caroline must have been about 6 when she got her first miniskirt, and it also had a slit up one side. Even though she wore lovely, frilly little pants, Caroline simply would not go out in that skirt until I had sewn up the slit. Caroline loved colors, greens, blues, yellows, reds, but she never chose garish designs. I think she was more proud of her school uniform than anything else. She said, "I doubt if in later life Caroline will ever be a trendsetter in fashion. She never did take much to dressing up when she was small." That's interesting. Her sister-in-law would be greatly into fashion, and her mother was greatly into fashion. But yeah, she does seem, it's not that she's not fashionable. I think she's very steady in her fashion choices is my perception of her. I don't know her very well, but the things that I see of her, she just always looks very sensible. Once we were going to tea at the British Embassy in Washington. Again, like it makes total sense that she's an ambassador now, because she at 7 years old was going to tea at the British Embassy. So Caroline had been invited by the children of the then ambassador, Lord Harlech. We discussed what to wear, and Caroline argued for blue jeans. Mrs. Kennedy agreed with me that Caroline had better put on a pretty dress. To my dismay, the Harlech children wore the most ragged denims I ever saw. Caroline turned on me. "You've made me get dressed up for nothing." A few days later, we were expecting the Harleches for tea at the White House. This time, we all agreed that sweaters and jeans were the order of the day. Unfortunately, we didn't tell the Harlech children, and they arrived in their best bibs and tuckers. Caroline thought it amusing, and whenever we had little disagreements about what she ought to wear, she'd remind me of that particular social gaffe. Things like that would definitely stick out in her mind, and probably make her a really wise woman in terms of hey, let's reach out to those people and make sure we all know that it's black tie tonight, or that we're all going to be casual. I mean, my guess would be that these lessons in early life have carried over into her adult interactions. Of course, now that she's grown up, she'll find that she'll be able to wear anything she likes and look elegant. She has a superb physique, and she moves so gracefully. I used to watch her going through ballet exercises, and she moved like liquid. I understand she's given up ballet now, and I think that's such a pity. Caroline never had a day's illness in her life except when both she and John had chickenpox, and she always had the same rosy cheeks and bright eyes. She talks about how Caroline didn't like her golden brown hair. She wanted it to be like her cousin, Sydney Lawford's. It says that was her closest friend among the Kennedy family, who was indeed lovely. So that would be Peter and Pat Lawford's child, I suppose. My understanding was that they had lived in California, and it was a different girl that she was with when we looked at the Rose Kennedy at 80 Life magazine. She was not with the Lawford daughter. She was with a different cousin. She says she always felt that Caroline would blossom into a really beautiful girl. Here we go. This is another story from the Fifth Avenue apartment. She says she'd come back from school with a whole load of lessons to do, and it wasn't always easy for her to study since the apartment was often full of friends and relatives. That makes sense. But she'd find the time to sit and pore over her books. She was very good at French, like her mother, and she got on well with history, but she had a tough time with mathematics. She says Caroline had one special trait. She always looked you right in the eye, in such a way that it was almost impossible to deceive her or for her to deceive another. You always had to tell Caroline the truth, simply and directly, because she would know if you were trying to step around something. It was like that when I had to break the news of her father's death to her. That was a time for honesty, not fairy stories, and Caroline understood. So yeah, Maud Shaw, the one writing this article, was the one to break the news while Jackie was in Dallas and then on the airplane at some point that afternoon or evening. Maud Shaw was the one who communicated to Caroline that her daddy had been killed and would not be coming back. A much happier example of her candor came when Caroline arrived at my home in 1965 and met my sister Hetty. Hetty and I always kid around with each other about who is older. Actually, Hetty is 7 years younger than I am, but she has gray hair. While we were sitting at tea, Caroline asked me who was older. "Oh, Hetty is," I said. "She's got gray hair, you see?" Caroline gave us each a candid stare. "But you've got more wrinkles than Miss Hetty, Miss Shaw," she said with devastating simplicity. "I think you are older." I think it's Caroline's honesty, level-headedness, and sensitivity that will enable her to live a balanced and stable life. She's going to be surrounded with luxury, but I can never see her taking advantage. For the first 7 years of her life, her parents lived at a frantic pace in surroundings that might have engulfed and mangled the character of a little girl if they had allowed it to happen. Thank heaven they didn't. I was free to raise Caroline, and to a lesser extent, John, in an atmosphere of love, serenity, and discipline. It's interesting. She's not holding back from essentially saying, I was the one to raise these children. And she really was. If we get a picture of Jackie during these years, Jack's traveling. Jackie was pretty involved, but obviously Maud Shaw did the raising. But there was lots of things like the trip to Dallas where Jackie might be gone for days at a time. So Maud was the constant in Caroline's life. And then after the assassination, we get this picture of Jackie as very, very deliberate in the moments and days following the assassination as she was planning the funeral. In fact, if you haven't seen it, we did an episode on that Life magazine, so that's worth checking out. And also the book of photography about all of the funeral plans that Jackie made. That was a fascinating look at her grand plan for celebrating the life and then mourning the death of John F. Kennedy. But after that time period, though, even though she was very deliberate in the days immediately following, we get a picture of Jackie of a lot of distress and emotional anguish, which is understandable. I'm not trying to judge, just saying that's what it was. And even that there was an inappropriate relationship with Bobby Kennedy that was quite well known in New York. And so during this time when Caroline is bringing home homework and not even having a quiet home in which to do it, there's activity. There's people around Jackie. She's having various affairs with men. She's got a social calendar. Of course, people want to know her and be around her. But Caroline's just a young lady trying to do her homework. And so it's so good that Maud Shaw was there to care for her and to provide some normality and structure. This is the end of the article. last little section. It says, I'm very proud to believe that I was largely responsible for shaping Caroline's childhood and to have had an influence on the rest of her life. When I look at pictures of her now and think of her, which I do often, I'm even prouder to see that the child I knew so well lives on in the young woman on the brink of adulthood. If I were ever to meet her again, I doubt that I would be disappointed in her, for I do not believe Caroline is going to change very much from the sweet child she was. Right now, she has the world at her feet. I understand she's going to continue her education in Paris and that she intends to travel. This was always her mother's wish, and it cannot do Caroline anything but good. I've always regretted that my last words to Caroline were tinged with such sadness for both of us, but that is the nature of goodbyes. Long before we came to England on that final trip together, Mrs. Kennedy and I had discussed our futures. For my part, I knew that I would have to leave the family someday. Not only did I have responsibilities to my ailing brother and sister, but I was also aware that Caroline and John might need someone younger to look after them. After all, I could no longer keep up with them when they ran and swam and bustled about. Furthermore, Mrs. Kennedy was conscious of her need to play a bigger part in her children's lives. I'm so glad. I had been her stand-in for over 7 years, and now she felt it was time to take over the reins herself. Y'all, I am glad for that. I hope that is sincerely what happened, that during critical years in both Caroline and John's life, that Jackie took it seriously. I might say that for once I was unable to tell Caroline the whole truth. It was going to hurt me, and I guessed it would upset her too. So I said I was staying in England for the summer, leaving the future open. I think this is indicative of the times. I think a lot of people thought it was better to tell a white lie, quote unquote, to a child rather than to give them a sense of the truth that would hurt them. Even so, Caroline wanted to tie it down in her mind. I hope this isn't going to happen every year, Miss Shaw. I know you don't like it at Hyannisport very much, but we're going to Newport too, and you like Newport. And then you'll be ready to come back again, won't you? It broke my heart to admit to myself that I wouldn't be going back. I waited for a couple months after that before I wrote to her and said I had to stay in England. Since then, I've rarely heard from Caroline, and it was as much through my choosing as anything. I simply didn't want her to think of me as part of her life any longer. She had her own life to lead, and a clean break is probably the best way to avoid heartache. Oh, y'all, it's sad because this is a woman who was part grandmother, part motherly role in her life, and just to be cut out all at once would be very difficult. But I mean, you understand from Jackie's perspective too, like if she had handed the day-to-day things over to this woman, it's very, very difficult to break into that kind of relationship. It makes me think of like military families where mom is just handling everything nonstop because dad's deployed. And so mom is like doing all the things, and then dad comes home, and it's very difficult to reintegrate and yield authority to this person who doesn't actually know as much about the day-to-day. And even if it's right, it's very difficult to do. Even if it's worth the fight to do that, right? To reintegrate it as a family, like a military family situation, that's very difficult. And it would have been difficult for Maud Shaw to yield some of the day-to-day decision-making or to yield her judgment to Mrs. Kennedy. So this decision makes sense, but yeah, that's difficult. There were postcards and odd gifts. In 1966, I returned to the United States for a visit. I wrote to Mrs. Kennedy and asked if I might see the children. I received a letter from her secretary saying it wasn't possible, but that something might be arranged in the future. I must admit that did hurt. Oof. Wow, that was maybe in Jackie and Bobby's years, and we don't know what was going on, but it is sad. That would hurt. I wonder, as I'm reading this, if she's actually writing this article and sharing these things with the hope of communicating ultimately to Caroline, because they had this special relationship and she wasn't able to say. So now she's able to say, I did actually know when I told you I was going back to England. I knew, but I didn't want to hurt your feelings, and I'm sorry. And you were precious to me, but a clean break was probably the cleanest and neatest way because your mom wanted to do what was right. And also, I did try to see you, and I was rebuffed, so I'm sorry for that. Like, it makes me wonder if she knew Caroline has the potential to read this one day, and I want to at least extend a line that I still loved her and wished her well. So Caroline, it painted her a card and wrote it in Easter 1965, so a year and a half after her father's death. She wrote, "I have nothing but love to give you." She knew it delighted me, although I doubt she knew how much it moved me. I still read it often, and when I do, I remember 1,000 things about my little Caroline, things we shared for 7.5 happy years. She's 16 now, and I have nothing more to give her except my continuing love and affection. So there's that. That's really, really a nice article from her. And then we get 10 years have passed since the assassination. So of course we get this picture of President Kennedy and Jackie. They're doing a 10 years post-assassination look. So of course they give a walkthrough of the assassination itself. But then we're going to get famous people's responses. It actually gives a pretty gruesome description of the shot itself. He was lifting his right hand slowly toward his throat. The great bronzed face swung glacially toward Mrs. Kennedy. The body teetered. Then, like a bashful lover, his head inclined and fell into the roses on her lap. This is interesting, actually. The time was 12:30, noon. Driver William Greer dropped his foot on the accelerator, and the big Lincoln snapped forward to dive for safety at the underpass, but there was nothing to save. The president was dead. The religious would manufacture a story that he had died a half hour later, after the sacrament of extreme unction had been administered, but that was a charitable fable. It's interesting. That's the first time I've ever heard anyone ever say that. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, first boy prince of the White House, died instantaneously. The heart, as a matter of habit, would pump blood into the open and partly empty cranium. When the supply was exhausted, the heart would stop. So that's a very clinical view of what was happening, but they're basically saying he was dead at 12:30. It wasn't 1:30. So then we get people's reactions. It takes us to Richard Nixon and where he was that day. It says he had left Dallas early that morning and had emerged from an American Airlines plane to face a group of reporters. Richard M. Nixon, beaten by Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election, was not running for office. He had been in Dallas working for a client. This is his quote to reporters. Quote, "The president may have to drop Johnson as his running mate. In the fight for civil rights, Lyndon Johnson has become a liability to the ticket. He may be more a hindrance than an asset." Nixon concluded the press conference, got into a company limousine, and left. A reporter ran out from the news shack. "Hey," he shouted, "Kennedy has been shot in Dallas." Interesting. Nixon, that's crazy that right beforehand he was saying Johnson might not be the right vice president at this moment. And what they don't know yet is that basically Johnson is the new president. They just didn't realize it. That's fascinating. Mr. Nixon's lack of knowledge of what had happened was no deeper than Lyndon Johnson's. The vice president was in Parkland Hospital, standing inside the drapes of a clinic cubicle. "Think he'll be able to make his speech at the Trade Mart?" Johnson asked. There were 2,000 people at the Dallas Trade Mart waiting for the president amid flowers and colored fountains. Reporters at the press table were given a police report of shots. And they began to run for parking lots. But diners are watching and saying, "Hey, watch out, what's the matter? Somebody get shot?" Yes, somebody did. Chief Justice Earl Warren got the news. He had been in the big conference room of the Supreme Court, conferring with associate judges about pending decisions. His secretary sent the message. The Chief Justice tried to mask his feelings of shock. It was impossible. The associates dispersed to their chambers. Earl Warren found it impossible all day to do anything but sit at his office radio. The days and nights he found were more like a nightmare than anything I have lived through. That's the way tragedy is, isn't it? It makes you, makes everything stop. No matter how important your work is, like there they were literally discussing Supreme Court decisions, but they're all like, "Yeah, we got to retire." And he just sits and stares at his radio. just trying to get more information. I've definitely experienced that at various points with news items. I remember that with COVID, where we all just were kind of like, what is going on? What is the new medical situation? How do we understand this properly? Baseball star Willie Mays remembers his reaction clearly. I just got sick. Mays heard the news just before he left for a San Francisco golf appointment, but he couldn't believe that President Kennedy was seriously injured. Mays was on the golf course when a caddy with a portable radio approached. "The president is dead," he whispered. It was a day for Lucille Ball. To be funny, the studio schedule said so. She and her husband, Gary Morton, were driving down Melrose in Hollywood when they heard the news. Lucy wept off and on all day. When each set was properly lighted, she was called before the cameras to create laughter. "I can't remember a more difficult show in my life," she said. The handsome blue-eyed evangelist Billy Graham feared the assassination before it happened. Graham and Smathers, the senator that JFK spent time with, had played a round of golf with President Kennedy in Florida, and a Texan phoned Dr. Graham a week before the president's trip. The man was, quote, alarmed by hostile feelings in Texas and asked Graham to use his good offices to cancel the president's trip. The president had been warned by others, but threats made him stubborn. When tragic word of the death came, Graham was playing golf. It was perhaps a harder blow to Graham than to others because he had seen it coming. The final look is Myrlie Evers. This is the wife of Medgar Evers. Her husband had been shot down by a rifleman lurking outside their home. When that had happened, President Kennedy had called them to the White House and expressed his and Mrs. Kennedy's personal condolences. In the nearly 6 months since her husband's murder, Myrlie Evers had been on an exhausting lecture tour, speaking out against, quote, the cancer of hate and prejudice that was making our country so sick. And when she got the news about Kennedy, she rushed home. Only then did the tears come. I had never let myself go when Medgar died, but I just could not control myself any longer. The similarity was too great, too personal. I thought of what the prosecutor had told the jury during the trial of the man who was accused of killing Medgar. If something is not done, the sight of the next rifle could be aimed at you. Wow. So, I'm so glad we've gotten to go through this. Heavy things, good things, interesting things. We got a little bit of more of a look at Caroline Kennedy's raising. We got a little bit of a look at Jackie taking the reins, and that's good to hear. I think that fits with what we wanted to know more about, is her kind of getting past the grief and saying, I'm going to go ahead and step into more of an active role raising the children. So that's good. And then we also have these famous people and their reactions 10 years later. I think I probably will do the Marilyn Monroe episode. Y'all let me know if you're interested. Let me know what you noticed. Let me know what stood out to you. I'm so glad you're willing to go through these things with me. This is so fascinating. It definitely fills in the gaps and helps us all process the information we're taking in. So I hope you have a great day. Bye.